What's up everybody and welcome to a new video. In the previous video we worked on the game aesthetics of the game, and now in this video we're going to refactor the code into a class. And since that is not really going to change anything about the game itself, I call this here a bonus to do. So now to do that we're going to go here into helper functions.py, and then first we're going to write here a comment that says class definition. And then here we're going to create the class and we're going to call it connect for game. And then within the function, we're going to first specify the init method. And that's namely the biggest advantage of using a class, because this way then we can save the game state within the class itself or within the instance of a class. And the game state variables that we're going to need are here, for example, the grid. So then here, let's say self.grid equals create grid. Next, we're going to need here this game active variable. So then we're going to say self.active equals true. Next, we're going to need here the current index. So we're going to say self.current index equals 0. Then we're going to need the starting player. So self.starting player equals then players brackets self.current index. And then lastly, we're also going to need here the current player. So therefore, let's just copy here this line. And then here we're going to say current player. So that is our init function. So now let's create an instance of this class in our game.py file. So therefore, then we're going to say game equals hf.connect for game. And then because we are storing now these game state variables within the class, we don't need to create them within game.py. So we can here delete this grid. Then we can also delete these three variables. And then lastly, we can also delete here this current player variable. However, for now, I'm just going to comment that out because I'm going to need that in a moment for an explanation. So now that we've deleted those variables here in game.py, we then have to access them via this game instance here. So to do that, let's search here for all the places where we use or access the grid. So let's search for that. And then here go to the first place. So here we're going to access this grid within this function call. And we're going to take care of that later when we then deal here with the function and where we decide if we want to put it here in the class or not. So then let's go here to the next place. Here again, it's used within this function call. So we're going to take care of that later when we deal with this function. So then let's go here to the next place. Again, this is within a function. And then here at the bottom, we're also always using here the grid within a function call. So we're going to take care of all of that then later. So therefore then let's search here for this active variable. And then here go to the first place. So here we're going to say while game underscore active. So therefore then to access that, we actually have to say while game.active. Then next, here at the bottom, again, this game active variable is used in the context of this function definition. So we take care of that later. Then next we have here the current index. So let's search for that and go to the first place. So this one here is within the comment. So we don't need to take care of that. Then here, this one is again within this function call. And then here, those last two instances, here we actually then have to access them by saying game.current index. So that's the current index. Next, we then have the starting player. So let's search for that. This is just used here within this function call. So we don't need to take care of that. And then lastly, we have here the current player. So here the first place is again this comment, so we don't need to take care of that. However, now here we have to access it by saying game.currentPlayer, and as well as here. So we're also going to say here game.currentPlayer. Then the next places are here all within function calls. So we are basically done with that. However, we have to do one more change, and this has something to do here with switching the player. So currently what we do is here at the beginning of this while loop, we create here the current player based on the current index. And then at the end of the while loop, then we update here the current index. So then in the next iteration of the while loop, what we're going to do is then we're going to switch here the player based on the new current index. However, now we are not creating here this current player anymore. So therefore then we have to switch the current player here at the end of the while loop. So therefore then we're going to say here game.current player equals hf.players brackets and then game.current index. So those are now all the changes that we have to make with respect to the init method. So now let's go through all of these functions here and then decide whether we should put them into the class as a method or if we just should keep them as a regular function. And the main criteria for that is going to be if the respective function needs access to the game state. So then here, the first function is this create grid function. So this simply creates here this list of lists. So therefore it doesn't need access to a game state. So therefore then we're gonna just keep it as a regular function. Then the next function is the show function. So here we put in the grid. So therefore it obviously needs access to the game state. So therefore then we're gonna put it into the class as a method. And therefore let's also use here this comment. So then let's now highlight here everything and then indent it. And then we can cut it and paste it into our class. So then here, the first parameter obviously needs to be self. And then here, because we can get access to the grid via the instance, we don't need to put here the grid in as a parameter. So let's delete this. And then here within the function, when we want to access that, we have to then say self.grid. And these are basically already all the changes that we need to make in this function. However, we can do one more change. And that's for the case when we call this function here with this column to indicate parameter. Namely, we did this here in the game.py file, here in this section, where we want to indicate where the move is about to be made. So here we use this column to indicate parameter. And here we passed in a tuple containing the current player and the column that the player wants to play. And we did that. So we did here pass in the current player because we had to know if we should print a yellow dot or a red dot. However, now we can actually get access to that current player via the instance, so we don't need to pass it into this function call here. So therefore then we can here simply delete that and only pass in the column. So then the change that we need to make here is in this line here where we then stored the values of this tuple into these two variables here. So we don't need that anymore. So let's just delete that. And then here we can get access to the current player by saying self.currentPlayer. And then here, instead of saying if I equals the column, then we're going to simply say if I equals the column to indicate. So if it equals here, this column that we pass into this function call. So those are all the changes that we need to make within this show function. So now let's adjust the code in all the places where we didn't actually call this function. So therefore, let's again simply search for this function here first in this helper functions.py file. And then here, let's go to the second place. So this here is then within this make move with animation function. So therefore then we're going to then take care of this function call when we then take care of this function here. So then let's go to the next place. And here again, we're going to use it within this isGameOver function. So the same thing applies. And then lastly here, we're going to use it in this asPlayAgain function. So then again, we're going to take care of that when we take care of this function. So therefore then in this helper functions.py file, we don't have to adjust anything yet. So therefore then let's go here into game.py and then here search for show. And then go to the first place here. So here we're going to call this function. So instead of saying hf.show, what we're going to do is simply here game.show. And then here, since it's not really clear what that function or what that method is supposed to show, I want to rename it here to saying show grid. And then here we're going to say game.show grid. And then we can get rid of this function call here. And then let's also get rid of these empty lines here. And then let's go to the next place here. So this is just a comment, so we don't need to adjust that. And then here, we're also going to call this show function. So therefore then again, we're going to say here game.show. And then we want to say game.show grid. And here then obviously we don't have to pass in the grid. So then let's go to the next place. And it's just another comment. So therefore now we have made all the adjustments that we need to make for this show grid function. Then the next function is this make move with animation function. And here we pass in the grid and the current player. So therefore it needs to have access to the game state. So therefore then we're going to put this into our class. So let's indent this and then cut this and then paste it into the class definition. So then here the first parameter has to be a self. And then because we can get access to the grid and the current player via the instance, we don't need them as parameters here. So let's simply delete them. And then here to get access to the grid, what we have to say is to say then simply self.grid. Then here instead of saying player, what we're going to do is say self.current player. And then here we want to call this show grid function. So therefore then we say self.show grid. And then we don't have to pass in here the grid. And then because we are modifying the grid directly via the instance, we don't actually have to return here anything with this method. So these are the changes that we need to do for or within this method. So now let's make the adjustments in all the places where we call this method. So therefore let's again search for it first here in helperfunctions.py. So here, as you can see, there's only this place. So we are not calling it within helperfunctions.py. So therefore then let's now go to game.py and then search for the function here. And then here, if we go to the place where we call it, then it is here. And then again, since this function or this method is not returning anything, we don't need to store its result into a variable. So therefore then we're going to simply say game.makeMove with animation. And then here we don't have to pass in the grid or the current player. So we're going to only pass in the column. So those are all the changes that we need to make with respect to the make move with animation function. Then the next function is this isFor connected function. And here we put in the grid. So it needs access to the game state. However, we are not going to put it into the class as a method. And the reason for that is the following. Namely, if I search for this function here and then look at the places where we call it. So here in this isGameOver function, we call it and then put in the grid. Whereas in the simulate moves function, we call it and put in the grid copy. So therefore then for this function here, for this isFor connected function, we need to be able to put in different grids. And we don't just need to access the grid that we've stored in the game state. So therefore then we're going to keep this simply as a regular function. So therefore then let's move it up here. And those are then already all the changes that we need to make with respect to the isFor connected function. Then the next function is this isColumnFull function. And here we pass in the grid. So it needs access to the game state. So therefore then we're going to put it into the class as a method. So therefore let's cut it here and then paste it into the class. And then here the first parameter again needs to be self. And then because we can access the grid via the instance, we don't need this as a parameter. So therefore then we simply say here self.grid. And those are already all the changes that we need to make within this function. So now let's adjust all the places in the code where we actually then call this function. So therefore let's search for it here again in helperfunctions.py. So then let's go here to this other place where we call it. So here we're going to call it. However, this is in this choose_column_AI function. So we're going to deal with that when we deal with this choose_column_AI function. So therefore then let's go back here to the definition. So within helperfunctions.py, we don't have to change anything. So therefore then let's go here to game.py. And then here let's search for the isColumnFull function. So here we're going to call it. So therefore now let's make the adjustments. So then we're simply going to say game.isColumnFull. And then we don't need to pass in here the grid, but we only need to pass in here the column. So those are all the changes that we need to make with respect to the isColumnFull function. Then the next function is this isGameOver function. And here we pass in the grid and the current player. So we need access to the game state. So therefore then we're going to put this function into the class as a method. So let's cut this and then paste it here. So then the first parameter is going to be self. And then because we can access the grid and the current player via the instance, we don't need them as parameters. So therefore then within the function for the grid, we're going to simply say then self.grid. Then to access the current player, we're going to say self.currentPlayer. And then here for the show function, we're going to say self.show grid. And then we actually don't need to pass in here the grid. So let's delete that. So those are all the changes that we need to make within this isGameOver function. So now let's adjust the code in all the places where we call this function. So again, let's search for it first here in helperfunctions.py. And there's only one place, so we're not going to call it in this file. So therefore then let's search for it here in game.py. So let's go to a place where we call it. So here we're going to call it. So then here we're going to say game is game over. And since that sounds a little bit strange, I want to rename this function here simply to be called isOver. So then here we can say game.isOver. And then here we don't need to pass in the grid or the current player. So those are then already all the changes that we need to make with respect to this isOver method. Then the next function is this asPlayAgain function. And here we are actually using all the game state related variables. So this function we are definitely going to put into the class. So therefore let's highlight it. And then we're going to cut it. And then let's paste it here into our class. So here then first let's get rid of all these parameters. And then here we're simply going to say self. And then here instead of saying game_active, we're going to say self.active. And then here when we want to reset the game variables, what we're going to do is actually we're just going to reset the game as a whole because we're going to create a new instance of the game. So we're going to say game equals connect for game. So therefore then we can get rid of this statement here where we create a new grid. Then next here we want to show the grid. So therefore then we're going to say game.showGrid. So we're not going to say self.showGrid because we actually want to show the grid of this new game here. Then let's get rid of this line then. Then next what we do here is we check if the starting player is equal to the current player. And if that's the case, then we update our current index. And we did that because we wanted to be able to switch between the players in between the different games. So for example, if player red started one game, the next game should be started by player yellow. So for example, if player red was the starting player and then also the current player. So if player red made the last move, then we want to update the current index so that then in the next game, the starting player would be player yellow. So therefore then for all of these variables here, now we need to access them via the instance. So therefore I'm going to insert here multiple cursors and then simply say self dot. And then next here, we're going to specify the new starting player. However, now we don't need to do that anymore because we are already doing that here when we create a new instance of the game because we are doing that in the init method. So therefore, let's go back here to the init method. So here we're going to say self.startingPlayer equals players and then brackets self.currentIndex. So here we're going to specify the starting player. However, there's a problem with that. Namely, self.currentIndex is always going to be 0. So the same player is always going to start the game. So therefore then to get around this, what we need to do is we need to be able to provide the current index to this init method here. So therefore then we're going to create here a new parameter and we're going to call it current index. And the default value for that is going to be 0. And then we're simply going to use that current index to specify our self.currentIndex attribute. And then we can also do here the same thing for the starting player and the current player. So this is now our new init method. Then now let's go back down to the asPlayAgain function. So then here, when we create an instance of this class, then we have to specify or provide here the self.currentIndex. And then to get here the correct current index, we actually have to put this if statement in front of this instantiation of our new game. So then lastly, what we need to do here is, or what we want to do is to return simply this game here. So therefore then we're going to say here, return game. And then let's get rid of all of these empty lines. So those are all the changes that we need to make in this asPlayAgain function. And now let's make the adjustments in the code where we actually then call this function. So therefore let's search for it here in helperfunctions.py. And as you can see, there's only one search result. So we are not calling it within helperfunctions.py. So therefore then let's go to game.py and search it here. And then let's jump to the place where we call this function. So here we are calling this function. So then here, let's first get rid of this line here, because this was just a helper line, because the line here or this function call was so long. Then next here, this function only returns here the game. So therefore then here we're going to say game equals, and then here we're going to say game.ask play again. And then here we don't need to provide any arguments. So those are all the changes that we need to make for this function. However, there's one more change that we need to make, namely currently here, when the answer is no, then we don't return anything. So therefore then by default, this function then would return a none. So in that case, then this game variable here would then be a none. So then if we go back here to the next iteration of this while loop, then here we say game.active. So basically we are then saying none.active. And since none doesn't have an attribute which is active, or which is called active, we would then get here an error. So to get around that, what we need to do is to simply here return the self. So this way then we simply return the old game. So in that way then what happens here is that this game variable is still the old game. Then we go back here to this while loop, and then here we're going to check what game.active is. And since that then will be here false, then therefore then this while loop will stop. So those are then all the changes that we need to make here for this asPlayAgain function. Then the next function is this makeMove function here. And here we pass in the grid. However, this is not the grid that we store in the game state. Namely, here where we call this function, we actually put in the grid copy. So therefore then we are not going to put this function into the class, but instead we're just going to keep it as a regular function. Then the next function is this simulate moves function, and here we are also putting in the grid. However, this time it's actually the grid that we are storing in our game state. So therefore we are going to put this function into our class. So let's then cut this and then go back to the class, and then here let's paste the function. So then here the first parameter is again going to be self, and then after that here we can get rid of this grid parameter, because we can access it by saying simply self.grid. And these are already all the changes that we need to make to this function, because this player parameter is actually not the current player. Because if we then here go back to this function where we are calling the simulate moves function, here we are passing in the AI, and here we are passing in the human. So we actually do need here this player parameter for this function. And then the next function is this choose column AI function. And here we put in the grid. So this also needs access to the game state. So therefore then we're going to put it into our class as a method. So therefore then let's cut this and then go back to the class. So here then let's paste this function. And then here we're going to get rid of this grid and simply put in here then the self. And then here within the function, we're going to say self.isColumnFull. And then here we don't need to pass in the grid. And then here for those simulate moves function calls, what we're going to say is also simply self.simulate moves. And then here we can get rid of the grid. So those are then the function calls. And with that, now we've made already all the changes that we need to make in this function here. So now let's adjust the code where we call this function. So therefore then let's again first look for this function here in this helper functions.py file. So there's just one search result. So we're not calling it within this file. So therefore then let's go here to game.py, and then here let's search for this function or for this method. So here then we're going to simply say game.choose_column_AI, and then here we don't need to pass in here the grid. So those are then all the changes that we need to make for this choose_column_AI function. And then the last two functions are the clear previous line function and the give feedback function, and they both have nothing to do with the game state, so we're just going to keep them as regular functions. So therefore let's put them here together with those other functions, and then let's put this comment here at the top of these functions. So here we're going to say that these are the other functions, and then let's delete here these other empty lines. So with that, then we are done with our refactoring. So now let's test if our game is still working. So let's run it, and then let's play here 2-player mode first. And then let's make here some moves to test if it is still working. And as you can see, it seems to be working. So now let's provide here some wrong input. So let's provide here an 8. And then it simply says the input must be a number between 1 and 7. And the game is still working. So now let's make here column 1 4 to see if that is also still working. So now let's play here column 1. And column 1 is already 4. And we can keep playing. So now let's create here a winner to see if that is also still working. Then here it says player red has won, and those winning dots are indicated, and then it asks us if you want to play again. So let's say yes to see if then player yellow starts. And then here, as you can see, player yellow is starting. So this code seems to be working. So now let's play 1-player mode against the AI to see if that is also working. So let's just make here some couple of moves. And as you can see, it seems to be working. So now let's just let the AI win. So now in the next move, it should then pick here column 5. So let's see if that's the case. And it picks column 5 and then wins. So our code seems to be still working. So with that, then we can check off here this last point in our to-do list. So therefore, then we have reached the end of the series. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in another series.